Today I'm going to be talking to you about progressive web applications and how they're essentially challenging two industries and how the software development industry is kind of segmenting into subsegments and how we can sort of stop that happening and have one sort of code base that adheres to different devices. So I'll just go into the obligatory slide. Who is this guy? I'm Jack Pritchard. I'm a freelance front-end web developer. I kind of touch on the back end a bit, but I'm predominantly front-end development. You can tweet me abuse about how bad my slides are, what Jack has made, or if you feel like posting a picture, you can feel free to do that too. I'm a student at Solent University. I'm doing my master's in creative enterprise, and I studied website design and development in my undergraduate degree, and a lot of my undergraduate course was focused on progressive web apps, especially my final major project, which I'll be discussing in the slides later on. So, as I mentioned earlier about blending industries, this presentation aims to sort of blend and merge and connect these different industries and how there are native mobile applications and online websites, responsive websites, and why there's no need to sort of separate everything to different solutions. We should sort of focus on building one unified solution which can perform as well as any other solution would. So the aims of this presentation is to inspire developers, and I'm no expert on this topic. I've developed my own progressive web app. I'm very familiar with the technologies used in a progressive web app, and I can talk about how I've done it and how you can be inspired from it. But if you want to learn anything in detail, especially about some of the technologies such as service workers, I won't be covering any of that in great detail, but I'll be covering the basics to sort of introduce you and lead you on to learning more about it. So before we begin, I want to first define the industries that I'm challenging or trying to blend. So our first industry is online websites and browser applications. So I kind of even see this as web apps, which are sort of more tools that people use online, booking services or online to-do list apps and whatnot, and then also brochure websites. They usually consist of front-end web technologies such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and back-end systems or server-side languages such as PHP and .NET. And then the second industry is iOS, Android, and other native mobile applications. So as far as I'm aware, Android is developed with Java, and iOS is developed with Swift. And this separation of code bases means that if you want to put out a web app which works in the browser and on iOS and on Android, you find a lot of companies are splitting hairs and creating native applications for Android and iOS as well as their website, when the majority of applications that are built for businesses aren't really needed. You've got a website which does the majority of the functionality. But yeah, those are the two industries that I'm going to be challenging. So we've got our industries, browser applications versus mobile native applications. I've got a question. I've done this talk once before, and I kind of just went straight into answering the question myself. But if anybody volunteers to answer it, why do mobile applications exist? Any?
Make Apple and Google money.
That is a great point. Yeah, Apple does like to take that big slice of the cut. Exactly. It's offline use. Yeah, if you ever went on the London Underground, you can't connect to anything. So as mentioned, mobile applications solved a lot of the problems, creating reliable solutions for creating applications where we could store data and files offline, can be used without an internet connection, and as you touched on, the inputs that you can get from a device, you want to be accessing data, motion sensing maybe, or video feed from the camera or the microphone. So we're essentially solving new problems with old solutions though by creating native mobile applications. the first successful smartphone, the iPhone, or the most popular smartphone to ever been created at the time, was in 2007. That was like more than a decade ago. And the web browser's come a long way in those 11 years, challenging the need for any mobile application when you can just build a web browser application. So what can we do with the web in 2018? Touching on the inputs from devices, you can now potentially access camera, microphone, orientation, tilt, and GPS. And I'll demo a couple of those now. So with a simple piece of JavaScript, I'm getting a feed from my laptop, which is accessing my webcam. This has to be done over HTTPS for security reasons. And you are prompted in the browser to enable the webcam or disable it. I'm sure a lot of you have probably experienced this. So it's nothing new. It's cool that you're able to access that with one line of JavaScript, which is requesting access to that media. And then microphone. So these are audio waves that I'm picking up and visualizing. You can do a lot with the data that you're getting from your devices. This is just a very crude, basic demo. But it's just to help visualize how I'm getting data from my device without the need for any frameworks or libraries. It's all built into the browser. This device orientation, this was a demo from the Mozilla Developer Network. It's just easier to show you than get out my phone and try and show everybody what's going on. And you can access this information even in some laptop devices and tablets. So, you know, the browser has a lot more access to the inputs that our hardware has. Nowadays, that wasn't there before. You'd either need a library or some sort of workaround, and nowadays you can just pick it straight out of the box. So a couple of inputs that we've covered. I didn't cover GPS because that's kind of hard to show off in a demo. I could try and emulate it and trick the browser into thinking I'm moving around, but I'll cover GPS later on when I talk a bit more about creating a progressive web app. So we've got our inputs, but that's no use if we don't have any storage offline. There's no point in having an input if there's no output, and that data is going nowhere if we can't use a file to access it. So the primary offline, I guess, storage for files tool that we have is service workers. And service workers essentially act as a proxy between your browser and the web. Any requests that you make over the network using your browser will first go through the service worker and then grab the new file and then back it up for offline use. It's essentially client-side caching. So if you go to a website once, if you've dictated it in your code that the service worker should cache the image directory in your website, then when you connect to that web page, it will back up all the images in the image directory. And then if you have internet connection, it will look for new images. But if you don't have any internet connection, it will use the backed up images with no internet connection. This is kind of a better diagram to visually explain what I'm referring to. So yeah, again, your app connects to the service worker and then requests the files. If you're online, you get the new files. If you're offline, you get the files that were most recently accessed. And again, with service workers, because it's essentially client-side caching, you can bust the cache the same way you bust a server cache. You can have versioning and void a cache when you want to send a ton of new files to your users. There are actually a ton of different processes you can use. This is just one method of using a service worker, but there are ways of using more strict service workers which force you to use offline files, but that's not the best solution. It's much better to check for new files every time that you're connecting to a web page, or frequently. So we've got files, they're accessible offline. Images, HTML files, JavaScript, and CSS. You've got your data inputs, but the last piece of the puzzle really lies in data storage. So when I was doing my dissertation, and I did check recently too, this IndexedDB is the best API that you can use in browser in terms of the most support you have across the board in modern browsers to store data that you could be accessing in the browser for offline consumption. So the example that I kind of gave when I first did the talk was, say you were on Airbnb and you were looking at places to go and stay. You have the wrapper or the shell of the application, which is the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, but the data is all of the information about the actual locations and how much they cost and when they're available. Using IndexedDB, you can store all of this in a browser within the, you can store all of this in a database within the browser. So the best way to show this off is if I inspect my slides. So I've created a test database, which is part of my slide deck. And we've got this database with a table, PWA benefits. We've got a key, Jack Pritchard, which is the name or the unique identifier. And then we've got an object, which is our value. And that contains some subfields. I'll show you later on how I use this method to store GeoJSON, which is a geolocation format for JSON. It's fairly similar to standard JSON. It's just got geometry points. But I'll be showing you how I did that with a larger application than just a test database. Cool. So the current state of the web. I believe we're entering an exciting time for the World Wide Web. We have inputs from devices that weren't available to us before. We have the power to store files offline, store data offline. This wasn't possible when the iPhone first came about. We were forced to create a new sort of category of software development where we're building for native devices because we didn't have access to all these tools that we have today. And because that sort of industry is so invested in, it's kind of hard to take a step back and look at alternative solutions. But hopefully this talk will help inspire you to somewhat think about that. And because we have all of these tools and technologies, there's a new term that's come about, which is PWA, or Progressive Web Application. Progressive Web Applications are best described as if you can imagine a website that works offline and online. It can be accessed anywhere in the world, in browser, as if it was a native app. So the main benefits of using a progressive web app, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a bit about how they work and building one, is that they provide an experience that people are very accustomed to. It's very much like an in-app experience that you'd get with a native application on iOS or Android. They leverage the technologies we've covered, embracing the concept of storing offline, and yeah, they're accessible. So this was a great quote I found from Ionic Framework in their blog. They said that a progressive web app is a web app that uses modern web capabilities to deliver an app-like experience to users, which when I show you a couple of demos in a second, you'll see it looks like an app, because like your consumers aren't really going to notice a difference between them besides the installation process. The term PWA was coined by Google. It's seen a rise in popularity, and more recent browser updates are seeing an embrace of the technologies that are like essential for you to be building a progressive web app. Originally it was just Google Chrome, but now we're seeing Edge is now supporting some of the technologies, and Firefox and Safari and the rest are sort of following suit. You won't get any support from Internet Explorer, obviously, because it's not auto-updating and nothing seems to work on Internet Explorer. So I guess this is last year. I was working at a company called Move2. They've specialized in video games and mobile app development. And I was working as a web developer, and myself or the senior web developer at the company, like the head developer, had seen on Twitter that Google were offering team training in progressive web applications. And at the time, all I knew was HTML and CSS and a little bit of PHP and no JavaScript. And the head developer knew, well, he'd been working for 10 years, so he knew so much more than me. But we both went along to the training day. Google essentially pioneered progressive web applications, so we just wanted to hear what it was about from the creators themselves. The senior developer learned a lot more than I did. I just got introduced to the concepts. But it was very exciting having the idea of adhering to different industries with one code base, because you're essentially reducing the amount of workload needed. And I'll go into some of the benefits of using a progressive web app over a native application in the next few slides. So the main takeaways that I got from going to Google were that progressive web applications aren't a new trend. They're not a trend at all. They're a new concept that's building on existing technologies that are now coming into the browser for all of us to use. Caching information and presenting it similar to how native mobile applications do, and any website, literally any website in the world can benefit from PWA technologies, because even if you're not going to build a website which works as an app offline, there's no website in the world which doesn't benefit from being able to cache files offline or access data offline. This is not just beneficial to improving the speed of websites, but also reducing the amount of data consumption for our users. It's kind of a no-brainer. So even if you don't adopt all of the fundamental concepts you need for a progressive web app, there's definitely at least one or two that you can pick out and use in any of the websites you're using in the future. Cool. So I'm going to show you some progressive web apps. So George.com. I'm not too familiar on who owns George. I think it's Asda's clothing brand, or yeah. So this is a progressive web app. It has a very familiar design. I instantly recognize it as either a native mobile application or a responsive website. The only thing that I would say that's different from a responsive website is that there's no browser bar, which I'll go into in a bit. And so you've kind of got like a shell wrapper, which if you have no access to data, you can still show the sort of structure of what the application is going to look like before you input the data. And then once the data is loaded, it looks exactly how it would any native application or responsive website. So that's all well and good for developers, but it makes no difference to businesses. But it actually does make a difference to businesses, because this was a case study posted on Google developers' progressive web app sort of archive, and they listed some statistics which were kind of enticing, even if you're not a big business person. You're getting 3.8 times faster average page load time, decrease in bounce rate, increasing conversion rate, more page views, and people were on the app for longer. So if you went to anyone who has the decision-making power in your company or in an agency, then if you show them these kind of statistics, it kind of helps illustrate the whole point of progressive web apps in terms of business talk, I guess. Also to the developers in terms of page load time and whatnot, if you're passionate about that. So that's just one case study. Another case study that I found this week when I was doing some more research into progressive web apps, trying to beef up my slides a bit, was Starbucks. So the Starbucks team or developer team were working on a progressive web app last year. I've actually had a look at the application before, but didn't know it was a progressive web app. And there were some statistics that were released in the last year. So the Starbucks app on iOS, it's 146 megabytes, but the progressive web app is 600 kilobytes. So it's 0.4% the size. It's less than 1/243 the size. And you don't have to go through the installation and boot up process. Progressive web apps are like lightning fast. As soon as you've added it to your home screen, it's installing in the background. You don't have to watch the bar slowly go up, especially if you've got 146 megabytes to download. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure the Starbucks progressive web app is only usable in America at the moment. But there are other progressive web app examples that you can have a look at today. These include Twitter Lite. I don't know if any of you use Twitter, but the Twitter progressive web app is so much quicker than the actual Twitter app. Instagram has a progressive web app. And I'll show you a web page at the end of the slides, which kind of gives you a showcase of a ton of progressive web apps you can go and install on your phone and experiment with today. So I'm going to move on to showing you how I made my own progressive web app and kind of go through all of the details about creating a progressive web app. This project is kind of outdated now. It was built about half a year to a year ago, which just shows how quick the web's moving if it's outdated. So I will show you a demo of it, but I'm pretty sure most of the site is falling apart now. I don't actually oversee the project at all anymore. I've passed it on to the co-creator. He's the business guy and I was developing it, but it got out of hand to the point where one developer working on the project wasn't enough and I couldn't maintain it. But that's another story. So this is a video which kind of shows you how I access the website in the browser, how I've installed it as a progressive web app, and then how I've accessed a progressive web app on my phone. At the bottom we've got add expelled to home screen. The footer is not responsive, but so when you click add to home screen, you're given a prompt, click OK, backed out of it, back to the home screen, scroll down, it hasn't been installed just yet. It gave a quick refresh and then expelled. Once you click on it, you get a splash screen with the brand color and logo. And then one key important thing to notice here is that there's no browser bar. And that's not because I've cropped the video or anything. That's because in the technologies that I'm using, I've specified that I want this to be a full screen video, full screen application, and not a windowed application or in the browser. How are we doing for time? Okay. Okay, cool. So before we dive into creating a progressive web application, there's a list of specifications that are required to be considered as a progressive web application. You need to register a service worker, which I'll cover briefly what a service worker is and how you install one. It needs to respond over 200 when offline, which is the status code for OK. Contains some content when JavaScript's not available, so your whole application can't just be app.js and writing a ton of DOM elements. It has to have some sort of fallback. Uses HTTPS. This is kind of a no-brainer. If your website isn't on HTTPS, I would highly recommend doing some research into that. Redirects HTTP traffic to HTTPS because as this is being installed on your device and it's caching files offline, you want to ensure that your security is up and all the files that are being stored offline aren't full of malware and malicious. The user can be prompted to install the web app. So as I showed you in the video, when I accessed the website, I was prompted to add it to the home screen, and then once I clicked on add to home screen, you're then given a second prompt where you can cancel or add. Configured for a custom splash screen, which you saw when I clicked into the app from my app drawer. Address bar, which uses the same color palette as the branding for Expelled, and then has a meta tag, which is essentially to stop websites needing to be pinched and zoomed. It auto scales it just as any responsive website would do. Again, content is sized correctly. That's kind of piggybacking off this point, but if you've got any overflowing content in your responsive website, then it's gonna look a bit messy and doesn't warrant as a progressive web app. And then finally, web application on Android home screen. So that last point is kind of a bit outdated because you can install it on iOS now as well, but that was the specification at the time. And I don't know if cool. So how are we analyzing the project? Google Chrome is hosting numerous developer tools. One of them is auditing your web pages. So you can audit for SEO, performance, and one of them is auditing for progressive web apps. So I'll just show you the tools. So this is my personal website, and I've run an audit. I'll show you how I went about that in a second. Where when you run an audit, you're given sort of like a checklist where it tells you what you've done right and what you've done wrong, as well as information as to how you can amend the things you've done wrong. To access this, you simply right-click, inspect, go over to the audits tab, and then you can select the progressive web app audit. Okay, it won't let me run one because I've got that open in another tab. So that's one way of doing it within the browser, but I also found out this week when I was browsing the web for performance tools that Google developers have released a beta website called web.dev, and you can input your URL for your website and then run an audit the same way you would in the developer tools. So you can see I've got performance, accessibility, best practices, SEO. So you can kind of run that. Could have sworn it had PWA stuff because I was getting. Well, you can do it within the browser and analyze how your website's doing, which is essentially what I did along my project. So at the start of my dissertation, you have to list out a list of requirements and specifications and what you hope to achieve and how you're going to measure that. And this is how we measure it. We essentially say, if we can tick off every single point, then we've got a progressive web app. If we can't meet all of the requirements, then it's not really a progressive web app. There are varying levels of degrees to what constitutes a progressive web app, but I'd say if your user isn't prompted to add it to the home screen, it's not a progressive web app. Cool. So the first point is registering a service worker. Service workers, they act as a cache. I've kind of already gone over kind of briefly what a service worker is and how it works. They're enabled through JavaScript and will cache the files that you list in the service worker file. The service worker file itself needs to be in the root directory of your website, or at least it did when I was building this. And you can get around this by using a symlink on your server or any other tricky ways. So the service worker itself is a JavaScript file, which you dictate all of the rules and the cache name and the cache version and what files you want to be downloading and storing for offline. But that doesn't register the service worker in your browser. You have to add in a little bit of JavaScript for that as well. So that's not a great contrast. I'll try and read it out loud for anyone who can't read that, because that's quite hard to read, actually. If service worker in Navigator, so we're essentially saying, is service worker available in the browser, then add an event listener to load. So when the web page loads, then we are registering a service worker with this absolute URL to my service worker JavaScript file. and then once complete, so we're using a promise, we will then run the console log and say, you've successfully registered this, or if not, then what errors did we get when registering? And so when I access the website, I'm given the console message that the service worker registration was successful. One note to mention, which is kind of a biggie for most full stack developers, or especially backend developers, service workers, they're storing files offline, so it's essentially storing your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and images. If you've got anything that runs server-side, it's kind of hard to, if not kind of impossible, to be caching that with a service worker, or at least to my knowledge. So a lot of it's going to be focusing on static assets. One tool that I'm using at the moment, which is perfect for kind of giving me service worker and progressive web app capabilities while still having a full stack solution, is something called Gatsby, which is a static site generator for React. So this website, well, if you have a website which is built on something like WordPress, which is on PHP, then you can use the REST API and import it to Gatsby and then generate HTML files. And so when you're storing HTML and CSS and JavaScript, you can actually store every single page that the user accesses. It's a lot more difficult when you're trying to cache assets for an actual vanilla WordPress install, because you'll only be able to sort of cache the images, CSS, and JavaScript. So point 2 is responds with 200 when offline. So for anyone who doesn't know HTTP codes, or I'm pretty sure 200 is okay, so when the status is successful. And that's normally done by providing a fallback offline. So you might have offline.html, and so when somebody goes onto your website and requests something, if they've already got access to the service worker, then the service worker can return a HTML file which says, oh yeah, you're offline, you don't have access to this otherwise server-side rendered pages, and so you've got a fallback. So when I accessed the website offline, I was given an offline and a tick, and it was just sort of cached information and data about the website I'd accessed. If I added any new spots, I wouldn't get that data pulled through. And I still need to show an index DB of that, but I'll come back to that. Contains some content where JavaScript is not available. As I touched on earlier, if you're using, app.js and rendering a ton of DOM elements to the page, then it's not going to warrant as a progressive web app. A progressive web app, in the name itself, is progressive. It's kind of the same as progressive enhancement. You're providing a fallback for the user, and if you're relying on JavaScript being enabled, then you're excluding anyone who doesn't have JavaScript enabled on their site, which kind of seems counterintuitive, seeing as you're using a service worker, but that's just one of the rules. So when you access the expelled website offline, there's a CSS with a loading icon and the general layout. So when JavaScript's available, I use the Google Map API, and that will generate the home page. I kind of should have explained what expelled was before getting this far in. I just realized I haven't explained what expelled is. Expelled skate is essentially it's a skateboarding website where it geolocates where you are and shows the skate spots around you. So if you're a skateboarder and you went up to Bristol for the day, when you get to Bristol, you open up the app and it'll show you all the skate spots around you, show you content surrounding that. It's kind of like a social media application. You can kind of see where the project started to get me dreaming too big and realizing I can't handle all this on my own. But yeah, it was essentially using a REST API, and yeah, it worked for the final major project, but growing it to an actual product needs more time. Anyways, back to building a progressive web app. So the website itself is stored on DigitalOcean using a VPS on Ubuntu 16.04. Uses Apache for routing, and I generated an SSL certificate using Let's Encrypt, which I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with. It's a great tool for generating yourself an SSL certificate. Instead of paying for one, it's the same quality as a paid one, so there's no disadvantage by generating yourself one and using one for free. If I had to pay for one every time I built a website, I'd be out of pocket. And yeah, so it's using HTTPS, as should most websites nowadays. Again, really bad contrast, but so I'm basically using Apache to convert any HTTP requests to HTTPS. So if I'm using a plugin or a framework or using an external resource, I want to make sure that it's HTTPS. So even if I know that I've made a HTTP request in my code, I don't want that to be carried out unless it's HTTPS. So converts it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But that's on me to check if the requests are working or not. But if you're going to be building a progressive web app, just as if you were installing any native mobile application, you want that to be safe. And this doesn't have the same vetting process that a mobile application would have. You normally have Apple or the Google Play Store, which will do quality control and make sure that the app isn't malicious, it meets a certain set of requirements. That's why Google have put together a list of specification requirements you need to meet, because that is essentially their vetting process. So the user can be prompted to install the web app. As you saw when I accessed the website, at the bottom you had add to home screen. And the minimum requirement for prompting a user used to be having a web manifest file, which I'll show you an example of in a second. I'm pretty sure Real Favicon Generator, is it Real Fav? Yeah. They give you a manifest file by default anyway, so if you're using a tool like that, you'll probably be given a web manifest file. I'm not sure what the requirements are nowadays to prompt the user, because I feel like you have to have certain images at certain dimensions for it to be usable, because my personal website is using a web manifest file, but because the images aren't 512 by 512 and 192 by 192, it's not warranted as a progressive web app. It has to be certain dimensions, because you don't know what device is installing the application. So I'll just show you an example. So this is the expelled Skate website's web manifest file. And I'll kind of go through all of the properties now, because the next 3 or 4 slides is essentially me referring to these properties. Name is the title of the application, pretty self-explanatory. Short name needs to be under 12 characters long. So expelled is kind of what me and my mate were calling it. So expelled skateboarding is the full-fledged name. Short name for when you have it installed on your app, and what you see on the home screen or the app drawer is expelled. And then we've got this sort of array of icons, 192, 384, 512, and also the types. As I said, real favicon generator. If you import an image, they'll give you all these cropped sizes, as well as generate this manifest file for you. Background color and theme color. Background color is the color that's shown when you're in the browser. So you might notice that when you go onto certain websites in Google Chrome on your mobile device or even other browsers on your mobile device. The browser bar will be a different color. It could be red, blue, it could be green, it could be whatever, whatever you want. That's specified with background color and then theme color. I'm pretty sure is used with the splash screen. So when you click on the app, you'll have the image you've specified on top of the color background, and that's what the theme color is. And then display is what I was referring to earlier when I said that when you access the application, it's not got a browser tab. It's as if it's any other mobile application. If you opened up Google Maps, you don't have a browser tab because it's an application. And that is essential to be giving a familiar experience to our users, because that's essentially the breaking point whether or not progressive web apps are going to work, is will users adopt it? Because if users don't adopt it, then it's never going to work. We can, try and force them to use it, but it's just never going to pick up. Start URL. So this is the web directory that the application goes to when you click on the icon. Orientation. So if your website works landscape and portrait, you can use any. But if it only works on landscape or portrait, you can specify. And then finally, language, which is English. Let me see. And then I also had another one, which it's a bit more trimmed, but the lines don't really help. So this is for my website. I've got a Gatsby plugin, which is essentially generating a web manifest file from like a JavaScript file I have, where I'm just inputting data to use. And I've had to manually crop these logos, but you can use a tool like Real Favicon Generator again. And I've, again, just input the information, and the web manifest file uses that in various different ways. It's not just progressive web apps that web manifest files use. There are, like the browser, as I said earlier, changing color, that's from the web manifest file. So I feel like that even having that file is beneficial because it's not just for progressive web apps. So these next few slides, again, they kind of touch on what I've just covered. You can set icons at different sizes in different web manifest files. You might be setting them at different sizes, but for progressive web apps, you at minimum need 192.384.512. Bad contrast. So actually, you don't really even need to read that. That's kind of just going over how I've listed out the custom images that are being used for the splash screen. And I didn't really have enough room on this slide to explain, which is why I kind of went and showed you an example file anyways. The background color and the icon are taken from the web manifest file. Again, background color, theme color. This is simply taken as a hexadecimal value from whatever brand you're working with. Every brand has a primary color. So this is a meta tag which goes in the head of your document. Most websites, or modern websites nowadays, have this meta tag, but you just want to double check on your website if you're considering turning it into a progressive web app that you have this meta value set. And again, just to explain what it does is it stops the need to pinch and zoom, but also I think it might take away the capabilities to pinch and zoom if you wanted to, where it'll just auto resize to the view that you've designed a responsive website for. This isn't, for anyone who's advanced, this isn't a trip up, but definitely for beginners. Again, content is sized correctly for the viewport. So Expelled was built mobile first. The photo in the video wasn't mobile first, but that was kind of beta mode. Images and videos, they resize and there's no overspills. So if you have any overflow on the website, then it's not only going to look bad because people can scroll horizontally when they're not meant to. It also just won't allow you to warrant as a progressive web app. Web application on Android home screen. So I kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but the main point to take away from this slide is that it's creating a smooth transition from native mobile applications to progressive web apps, because users aren't going to necessarily care about the benefits of progressive web apps until they start using it and see that it's a lot quicker. But you need to create that transition. And that's kind of a teething point, which is where progressive web apps are kind of, I wouldn't say they're having difficulties with, but I feel like there are different routes that progressive web apps need to go down for it to be an easier transition. At the moment, if you go to a website and it's prompting you to install, I don't know what most consumers are going to do when they're prompted to install. Those who do see benefits, and I would install it if it's a website that I use often, but it kind of just seems a bit, I wouldn't call it spammy, but kind of an uninvited notification. But having it where when you do click add to home screen, it adds it to your home screen, it kind of blends what a mobile application and what progressive web application is, and the user won't know any difference once it's installed. So basically built a PWA. So I'm pretty sure the requirements are going to change in the future. I don't feel like it's going to get, there's not going to be a lot more change, but I feel like there's going to be fine-tuning over the next several years. But according to the specification at the time, the PWA was complete. I met all the requirements. When I ran my audit, it gave a tick on every single point, and therefore my project was a success, and I graduated my course. I mean, I would have graduated if I failed, but it's just easier if it goes right. So just to recap, this is all the topics I've kind of covered when creating the progressive web app. And yeah, just when you do build your own, or if you do, be sure just to use Lighthouse. Lighthouse is the best tool to be analyzing your page. It comes straight from the developers who have, built this concept, and it's great for keeping track of what you need to do to improve to become better, create a better progressive web app, and even gives you links to resources where you're going wrong and kind of gives you tips on how you can do it better. So our PWA is compatible in the browser yet. There was this funny website put up which is service worker ready, and when I was doing my dissertation it said no, and it said no for a long time, but it's now saying yes, and essentially it was checking across what browsers supported the core technologies that are needed for a service worker to work. So Samsung Internet was quite quick to the scene. I'm pretty sure it was Chrome and then Samsung Internet, or it might have been Firefox, and then Edge, Safari and Opera came along later. So promises, debugging, if it's in the browser, if you can register, unregister, and yeah, it's all there. Background sync, there's only Chrome at the moment by the looks of things, but I'm sure they'll all catch up eventually. But yeah.
Are these desktop browsers or mobile or both?
These, I think it's a mix. It's a mix of both, because I will touch on some of the cool stuff that's happening with desktop browsers. But yeah, actually I have a can I use link as well. This doesn't cover service workers, but this covers another one, which is the web manifest files. So the web manifest file, I'll touch on service workers in a moment. As you can see on the left side, we've got all of this red, and that's kind of alarming, but the majority of desktop browsers aren't using the manifest file. It's mainly mobile browsers. So fortunately, the majority of mobile browsers, or modern ones, support it. Weirdly enough, IE doesn't support it. I didn't even know IE mobile was a thing. And then BlackBerry and Android browser don't support it, and Opera Mini. Opera Mini is kind of a difficult one because it doesn't necessarily support a lot of features nowadays. Yep, so service workers. As you can see, it's supported by the majority of browsers nowadays. Internet Explorer, you're not going to get any support on. Opera Mini, again, no support. But then the majority of mobile browsers, you're getting a lot more support again. Similar to, well, it's more support than the web manifest file. So touching back on the point that I made earlier on, your website benefits from using progressive web app technologies, even if it's not a progressive web app. Implementing a web manifest file brings you no harm, takes you 30 seconds to do, and creates a better user experience or a more in-brand experience if you want to change brand colors for the browser or implement logos. And it's great for if you're installing an application to a device, even if you're just adding it to home screen. And then service workers, I've kind of gone over the whole benefit of service workers. You're essentially client-side caching, and it's not just mobile devices, it's desktop devices too and desktop browsers. The cross-compatibleness of the technologies that progressive web apps use, specifically in modern browsers, but I'm going to touch on the new support that Apple gave. So since iOS 11.3, Apple now supports service workers and progressive web applications. I don't have an iOS device, so I can't tell you from first-hand experience that they work just the same as Android. If anyone has iOS, they can have a look at some of the applications that I show at the end and see how they fare on that operating system. The update increases the scope of potential users of your progressive web applications or any web applications that can take benefit from the technologies, service workers, manifest files. As I kind of touched on, and we had a discussion about how Apple doesn't want to give away their big profits, it was kind of a big change to see iOS take it on board, because now that iOS and Android support it, there's so fewer restrictions on how many people can take benefit from it. And Microsoft have actually got some cool, I guess that's a broken image. Microsoft have also taken benefit of progressive web apps. The Microsoft Store, I don't know if anyone actually uses it that much, but if you have a Windows 8 or above machine, I'm pretty sure you can access the Windows Store and install applications straight to your desktop. So progressive web apps are now being listed on the Microsoft Store. Microsoft are kind of taking on board that progressive web apps aren't just for mobile devices, and seeing as the Microsoft phone didn't fare well, they're sticking to desktop. And I think this is going to be something that is quite a big game changer, because it's kind of trying to blend another industry, which I'm not going to try and challenge, because I feel like software development is still important across all devices. I'm just sort of questioning whether we need to have as much investment in certain mobile software development. But if desktop computers can start to install applications which are progressive web applications, then you're starting to remove even more barriers of what operating system are you on, what browser are you on, depends on what applications you can install. Because that is the #1 most beautiful thing about the World Wide Web, is that it's accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a device which can connect to it. So it's been removing barriers in terms of people accessing content and information online, but now we're seeing a shift to, it doesn't matter what device you're on, you can use this application. Gone are the days where you needed to install Microsoft Word. You can now use Google Docs, and which one's better is up to personal preference or what you're using it for. But the fact that we're getting these app-like experiences in the browser and not having to install software is a beautiful thing. And I think that it's definitely where the World Wide Web's going. We've had responsive web design, and we've had shifts in how our websites are used. And now we're getting even more powerful tools and frameworks where we can build applications and not just sites. We're building tools that our users can complete tasks with. It would be great to see restrictions removed everywhere. So this is a pretty cool website that Google showed me and the senior developer when we went and visited. It's called PWA Rocks, and it's a directory of progressive web apps, and it doesn't list some of the more notable case studies that Google developers have listed on their own website, but it does show off some of the more fun, I guess you could say, or micro apps that kind of take benefit from progressive web app technologies. You might notice some of them: SVG, OMG, Financial Times, WebFlap. It's just Flappy Birds. My favorite one is Wiki Offline. When I first started talking about progressive web apps to my lecturers and peers at university, a lot of them didn't seem to grasp the concept of progressive web apps, or I don't know, I guess talking about progressive web apps is one thing, but being able to show it visually and functionally is a completely different thing. So what I did was I went through a couple of the PWA Rocks archive case studies or projects and found that Wiki Offline proved the best one. I haven't used it on desktop, I mainly use it on mobile, but you can install it on your mobile device, and essentially what you can do is you can search for a Wikipedia article, and then when you access the Wikipedia article, you can click on, it's kind of like a slider, and it allows you to save the article for offline use. And then what I would do is I would go offline on my device, show my peers that I'm going around the application as if there's no barriers, I've got no internet connection, but I can still access the article that I originally accessed with the internet connection. And that is basically, breaking it down to its basic concept, is accessing information offline in a container which uses the files that we've backed up using the service worker. Yeah, so if you do want to have a little play around and see what progressive web apps there are, I highly recommend this site. It's great to just see the different variations of how technologies are being used. Pokédex is a fun little one. It's just stores information from a JSON API about Pokemon, and you can store that information offline, similar to the Wiki Offline. So I'm going to be uploading these slides on my website probably tomorrow. So if you do want to click on any of the links, you can do so tomorrow, or if you want to take a screenshot, you can type these in your browser later on. But as I kind of mentioned at the start, this talk wasn't to give you a tutorial on how you can build a progressive web app. I'm not an expert on progressive web apps. If anything, I'm kind of, I know more than you could say people who don't know about progressive web apps, and I built my own, and I understand how to analyze and see the specifications, but I'm not the industry leaders. And you know, these links will take you to further resources. Jeremy Keefe put out a great book called Going Offline, where he basically documents how you can build service workers. If I tried to teach you how to build a service worker, it'd be terrible. I'd be basically regurgitating Jeremy Keefe's information. And he does it in a way where the ideas and principles he shows can be applied to any web application, not just your case study or your case. Pwa Stats, this is a crazy website where it shows you some of the case studies that I kind of touched on earlier, where George.com saw a great increase in traffic and user retention and conversions. Pwa Stats has sort of little cards which show you how different businesses all over the world are benefiting from progressive web apps. So if you are trying to speak to the powers that be who dictate whether or not you're building progressive web apps and it's something you're passionate about, then I would definitely check out Pwa Stats, grab some statistics that you can show your boss, and he or she will go, wow, like, why are we not doing this? Google case studies is the #1 resource to go to if you're looking for some of the bigger brands or applications that have benefited from using progressive web applications. And then Henrik Jord, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. He had a great blog post which kind of covered the Starbucks progressive web app. I'm pretty sure he worked on the Starbucks progressive web app, and he talks in his blog post about why he was betting on the web from the start, because he saw that there was a divide. He had a choice when he was starting software development to either become a web developer or become a native application developer. And another thing too, I'll go on to it in a second, I'm not trying to, I don't know, slander or like deface the idea of creating native applications. There's definitely a place for it. But he thought that the World Wide Web is, the beauty of it is kind of what I was touching on earlier, where it's void of needing to be on a specific operating system. It can be used anywhere in the world. People were developing BlackBerry applications when BlackBerry was a thing, and BlackBerry died out, and those developers invested all that time into learning something which eventually became outdated and not used at all. Whereas if you're learning for the web, I feel for like at least the next 10 or 20 years, the web as we know it is going to keep growing. Whether or not user interfaces start to disappear and whatnot is another thing, but definitely the functionality is always going to be there. And then finally, at the bottom, there's a React PWA tutorial if anyone's using React. If you're using something like Gatsby, like I mentioned several times throughout the talk, you can get a plugin which will help you build a progressive web app. But it's fairly straightforward if you follow along with the tutorial. I showed you how I built mine, but you know, as with any web technologies, it's forever changing, and it's going to change in the next few months. So where should you be using progressive web apps? As I mentioned, progressive web apps are beneficial to the majority of websites. No user is going to suffer from cached files unless files are constantly changing on the website, or if they get stuck with an old cached version of the website that they shouldn't be using anymore. And as I touched on, you can void the cache and serve up new files. When not to use progressive web apps. So coming back on where I said native applications have a place. Large applications such as mobile video games, existing client projects where it will require a significant amount of large refactoring, and with clients who don't share the understanding of the benefits. Some other use cases for not building a progressive web app is server-side technologies are almost impossible to be storing offline because it's server-side, it's not client-side. So if you've got a large application which is based server-side, then you're going to have a very big challenge ahead of you and a lot of refactoring. And yeah, essentially. So progressive web apps aren't always appropriate. So a bonus slide before we get to the end. I was talking, I did this whole presentation at Solent University for the BCS. And somebody in the crowd was like, I'm building these, if we wanted to build a progressive web app, but we didn't want it to look like a website, we wanted it to look like an Android or an iOS native application, what options are there? Is there a library we can use? And I was like, I have no idea. And then somebody else in the crowd shouted out, and they were like, yeah, you can use Framework 7. So this is essentially a CSS and JavaScript framework where you can build front-end user interfaces. So this is iOS and Android, and then you can go into the different, I guess, design patterns that you would normally get, dialog box. So you could basically import this to the project you're working on, whether it's new or existing. If you're making it go from iOS to a progressive web app, but you want it to look like iOS, depending on what device accesses your website, I'm pretty sure you can load different styles. So if they're on iOS, iOS interface. If it's Android, Android interface. And it looks pretty interesting. I've not used it myself, but from what I can see, it brings a ton of benefits. You can use it with Vue and React. You can do payment methods, built-in monetization. So yeah, you could essentially skin it like an Android or iOS application if that's what your client wants. And it wouldn't take too much difficulty to do. Yeah, that's just a bonus slide, I guess. So conclusion. Yeah, hopefully I've given you some food for Again, I'm no expert, but hopefully I've given you sort of insight as to technologies that are being used, and maybe it's something that you can now go forward and explore a bit more. Hopefully it's piqued your interest, because any website can benefit from the technologies used. It's not just progressive web apps. I haven't given you a tutorial, a written tutorial or visual tutorial on building one. I've just shown you how I've done it, and what was necessary to build one in 2018. So yeah, with the web moving, I feel like the biggest web shift was responsive website design in recent years. I feel like progressive web apps could definitely be what is the next shift for the web. Again, it comes back to, will customers adopt it and consumers? But even if they don't adopt it, everyone benefits. I did have one idea, which one of the articles also touches on. So he probably had the original idea, but I came up with it as well. Is that progressive web apps have this really big barrier ahead of them. We've seen Google introduce their own operating system recently with, I think it's the Chrome Notebook, or is it the Chromebook? I'm not sure what it's called. But you can't install the same like applications you would on a Windows or iOS device. It's very restrictive. You can have Google Docs and whatnot. And apparently there's been quite a lot of resistance to people taking that on board because it's quite limiting. And this all comes from a question that was asked at the last talk. But I feel like that resistance comes because you have no option. If you have a Chromebook, you're told you can only install these kind of apps. Whereas with progressive web apps, it's just an option. It's not enforced. It's, oh, you're using the website. Do you want to use a progressive web app? No, you don't have to. It's just an added benefit. And the number one thing that I could see, which would totally bring in progressive web apps to every single user in the world, or those who install apps, is being able to include the option to install a progressive web app or a native application from within the Google Play Store or the iOS Store. Apple wouldn't do that, but it'd be great. Imagine going to the Google Play Store and having even just the option to install a progressive web app or not, to introduce these concepts to consumers. Because if I had the option to install an app which was 100 megabytes or 500 kilobytes, I know which one I'd be choosing. Especially if it offers the exact same functionality. It's really annoying because, as I touched on, like, the web is a beautiful thing because it's accessible to anyone, and we've seen it grow immensely because of the incentivization of companies making money. Like, this, in a real world, that's how things grow, is if money's invested. But it's painful to see that Apple are being so reluctant, and it seems like such a cash grab where they're stopping the web progressing because of monetary reasons. Like, that's not what the web's about. It's never what it's been about. But yeah, tangent. Cool. Yeah, for businesses, yeah.
So we probably should wrap it up.
Yeah, cool.
So,